Mr. President, we are under the impression that some of the elected UNSC members came to the Council pursuing a single priority: to serve as a mouthpiece for lies of the war party and accuse Russia of all ills, completely ignoring the causal links that are precisely the reason for the deepest crisis in European security. They believe that they are blameless. Our supercilious ex-partners have never seen and still do not see the plank in their own eye. They suffer from political color blindness, seeing everything in black and white. The Russian army carried out one massive and four-group airstrikes through January 9, which resulted in damage to transport, airfield, port, and energy infrastructure facilities that sustained the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, as well as temporary deployment sites of the Ukrainian troops and foreign mercenaries. This was done in response to the attack waged by the Kyiv regime on the Russian president's residence and civilian infrastructure in our country. The strike was carried out using the Oreshnik missile system, against which there is no air defense protection so far. Our Western colleagues keep telling us about civilian casualties, but most of the casualties were caused by the operation of Ukraine's air defense, which is something that everybody, including Ukrainians, is well aware of. All these loud but completely groundless allegations about Russia's targeted attacks on Ukrainian families who were peacefully sleeping in their homes are uncorroborated by any facts or evidence whatsoever. The Russian armed forces do not target civilians. At the same time, our Western colleagues tend to completely ignore the crimes that are being committed by the Kyiv regime, which is deliberately targeting Russian regions, striking at civilian facilities and civilians. Thus, in December 2025 alone, at least 367 civilians were harmed by the Ukrainian strikes. 56 people died. Against this backdrop, we are astounded by the silent response on the part of the international community, especially the UN Secretary-General, and this has become the norm. Refusing to clearly qualify such actions as terrorist acts and dismissing them as unconfirmed facts is tantamount to renouncing the basic principles of international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and the prohibition of premeditated attacks on civilian targets. Yet, as soon as Russia deploys its military against the Ukrainian armed forces and its infrastructure, emotions start to run high, which is followed by unequivocal comments from the Secretary-General and his spokesperson. Such selective blindness is, unfortunately, a hallmark of the UN Secretariat's leadership. The absence of response from the so-called collective West, much like the complete disregard for the tragedies by leading Western media outlets, has become a lamentable norm. De facto, this is nothing but covering for the terrorist attacks committed by the Kyiv regime and complicity therein. After all, responsibility for what is happening lies not only with those who are pulling the trigger, but also with those who for years have encouraged impunity, supplied arms, and provided political cover for such actions. This is what the billions of funds allocated to Ukraine from the pockets of European taxpayers are actually being spent on. But sooner or later, one will have to bear responsibility for this complicity, for all this aiding and abetting. We have repeatedly stated that no belligerent action on the part of the neo-Nazi clique entrenched in Kyiv will go unanswered. What was utterly outrageous is another hideous terrorist attack committed against civilians in Korli, a resort town in the Kherson region. Civilians, families with children, locals and visitors, gathered in the hotel cafe to celebrate New Year's Eve 2026. At that very moment, Ukrainian terrorists launched a premeditated strike on this place. As a result of this terrorist attack, 29 people perished, including 2 children, and over 30 were wounded. We don't have the slightest doubt that this odious attack was premeditated and deliberate. Before the strike, a reconnaissance drone was loitering over the settlement for a long time. This serves as further confirmation of the fact that Ukrainians knew full well what and who they were striking at. The attack was carried out just before the clock struck midnight, right when civilians were in the building. For those of you who don't know this, the village of Korli is located in a resort area on the Gorky Kut Peninsula, surrounded on three sides by the Black Sea. It lies beyond the so-called Red Line. There are no military facilities in the area, nor have there ever been any. The local former seaport has long lost its significance, and the area has been developed solely for leisure purposes. There are children's camps, recreation centers, and other tourist infrastructure. This vile terrorist attack stands out for its utter cynicism. While the media controlled by Ukraine's presidential office were broadcasting the New Year's address by the expired ringleader of the Kyiv regime with his fallacious calls for peace, Ukrainian troops at that very moment were deliberately annihilating civilians. Colleagues, we are no longer surprised by the narrative we hear today in this chamber. This narrative comes from those who, using their beloved double standards, request Security Council meetings on Ukraine while hypocritically turning a blind eye to the ruthless killings committed at the behest of the Zelensky regime, which is mired in terrorism, corruption, and lawlessness. And Zelensky himself is seeking to get as much money and weapons as possible from his European puppeteers, both for himself and his entourage. This terrorist attack is not an exception, but just one of many examples of inhumane crimes committed by the Zelensky regime against peaceful Russian civilians. USG Rosemary DiCarlo at least mentioned them today, but the UN, as always, cannot verify anything. 500,000 people in the Belgorod region are left without electricity, but the UN cannot verify this for some reason. The Ukrainian clique won't be helped by anything, neither by the failed French summit of the Coalition of the Willing, nor by the advance of NATO forces towards Ukraine's borders. We have repeatedly spoken about the possible consequences thereof. Although many people have recently championed this, it is the threat of such presence, alongside our desire to end the war waged by the Kyiv regime against its own people, that served to a large extent as a trigger for us to start our special military operation. Nor will the clique be helped by incantations about a ceasefire, which they hope would give them some respite from crushing defeats on the battlefield. Nor will Zelensky be helped by his absurd conditions, which have nothing to do with reality. Well, he drifted away from reality long ago. By putting forward his conditions in response to the US proposals, he is essentially nullifying what is being done by the US. All of a sudden, the European Commission started discussing that at some point the EU would have to engage in dialogue with Russia. It begs the question, where have you been all this time? We have never turned away from dialogue. It is you who arrogantly assumed that it would not go that far, since you banked on inflicting a strategic defeat on the Russian Federation. Until the Kyiv ringleader comes to his senses and agrees to realistic terms for negotiations, we will continue solving the problems by military means. He was warned long ago, and the conditions for negotiations will only get worse for him with each day he squanders. And every horrific attack on peaceful Russian citizens will elicit a harsh response.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Presidency of Somalia for convening today's meeting, as well as the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, Liberia, and the United Kingdom for their support of Ukraine's emergency request. I'm also grateful to Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Raja Singham from OCHA for bearing witness of new horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity that Russia committed in the last weeks against the civilian population in Ukraine. We praise the leading role of the UN in providing humanitarian aid to those who have suffered. Every time the international community believes that Russia has reached the limits of lies and barbarity, Moscow once again outdoes itself, finding the way to sink even lower and proving that there is no bottom of its criminal intent. Russia deliberately waited until early January, when temperatures in Ukraine plunged to minus 15 degrees Celsius, to unleash some of its most devastating drone and missile strikes against our energy infrastructure, pushing millions of civilians to the very edge of freezing. What we are witnessing these days echoes some of the most infamous precedents in human history, when evil empires sought to break civilian resistance by weaponizing cold, hunger, and darkness. From ancient sieges to medieval winter blockades, history teaches us that deliberately depriving civilians of heat, light, and the means of survival is among the most appalling methods of warfare. The horrific consequence of Russia's brutal attacks was that millions of peaceful Ukrainians, including my family in Kyiv, are left for days without electricity, without heating, without water supply, at a time when temperatures at night are approaching minus 20 degrees. This new horrifying wave of terror, also inflicted earlier last week to many other cities across Ukraine, including Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, and Odessa, reflects the determination of Putin to slap in the face of US mediators and continue his barbaric war. The reason why I recall the horrors of the Second World War is not accidental. Ukrainians belong to the biggest victims of Nazism. 80 years ago, that terrible war, which raged on our soil, claimed the lives of up to 10 million Ukrainians. Next month, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will enter its 13th year and the 5th year since the full-scale invasion of 2022. It has now lasted longer than the war between Third Reich and the Soviet Union, 1,418 days. So when we compare World War II to Russia's military invasion now, the parallels are becoming increasingly shocking, not only in the sheer duration of Moscow's brutal war against Ukrainian statehood, but also in the scale of destruction and, tragically, in the mounting toll of human suffering. The level of Russia's systematic crimes we are witnessing day and night has reached an unprecedented height. This Council can no longer ignore this outrageous war. Every single day that the Security Council fails to act to end Russia's war brings more victims. Distinguished colleagues, apart from the barbaric tactics of scorched earth that Russia's troops are employing against the Ukrainian population, there is another reason why Ukraine requested this emergency meeting. During the night of January 9th, Russia not only launched one of the deadliest strikes of missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities, for the second time, Russia employed the so-called Oreshnik, an intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile system, against my native region of Lviv, situated just a few dozen kilometers from the EU and NATO border. Since this weapon can carry a nuclear payload, such a blatant attack represents a clear threat to the security of the European continent, undermining regional stability and posing serious risks to broader international peace. Russia has spiraled into a new level of escalation. The fact that Russia now attempts, as we just heard, to justify again this cynical strike by referring to a fake attack on a Putin residence that never occurred is just absurd. But there is nothing new in this approach. Russia began its war of aggression against Ukraine under a fake and fabricated pretext. Russia's claim, which is ridiculous, with Putin's residence is reminiscent of the Kyiv incident on 31st of August 1939, when Adolf Hitler staged a false flag attack on a radio station to justify invading Poland. The perfidious logic is identical. The aggressor state fabricates a casus belli where none exists. Let me be clear, this so-called attack on Putin residence is an absolute lie, period. The true purpose of Russia's assault with its alleged Wunderwaffe, Oreshnik, is brutally clear: intimidation of Ukraine's allies and partner. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and now deputy secretary of the National Security Council, directly confirmed this in his X post, commenting it in a prison-like jargon. I quote, The ruling European dimwits want a war in Europe after all. It's been said 1,000 times Russia won't accept any European or NATO troops in Ukraine, but no, Macron keeps peddling his pathetic bullshit, Well, come on, this is what you'll get, end quote. And then Medvedev joyfully shared a video of the Oreshnik strike in Lviv region. Putin claims that this high-tech Oreshnik missile cannot be intercepted. This is just a joke. The so-called super weapon he boasts about is little more than just a trinket. Our experts who analyzed the remnants of this missile found a gyroscope of the very same type with which Yuri Gagarin flew into space over 60 years ago. Mr. President, Russia portrays itself and this brutality against Ukraine as a display of power, attempting to threaten international community. Russia wants to sell to this Council and the whole UN family the impression that it is invincible, but this is another illusion. The carefully staged image of strength is nothing but a smoke and mirrors, completely detached from reality. The Russian leadership is like a game player holding the worst possible hand, yet Putin keeps a perfect poker face pretending that he has an ace up his sleeve. In reality, Russia's cards are extremely weak. Russia's position is getting more fragile every day, and its bluff is evident. The Kremlin used to puff off its cheeks and flex its muscle, but it is all just a fig leaf, hiding the weakness of the Russian war machine, which is inevitably approaching its critical point. What Russia tries to project as its strength is in fact nothing else but a manifestation of vulnerability, reflecting its failure to achieve strategic military goals on the battlefield. Distinguished members of the Council, let me present you just a few facts which will demonstrate that Russia is losing this war. It is not a question of if, it is just a question of when. Russia's economic and social foundations are under immense strain. Growth is fully dependent on defense procurement rather than genuine economic productivity. 2025 was a breaking point of Russia's economy, which saw a dramatic shift from short-term wartime growth to long-term economic stagnation. Initially, following the invasion, Russia benefited from high global commodity prices and a spending-fueled boom, but these factors have now disappeared. The combination of weak growth, rising taxes, and reduced revenues points toward a deteriorating economic ability to further finance this war. With reserves depleting and structural damage accumulating, most experts agree that the Russian economy is and will remain at its weakest point since the turbulences of the late 1990s. 2025 showed that Russia's economic growth, driven by wartime spending, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Russia's military production temporarily propped up GDP in the first years after the large-scale invasion, but the economic boost from militarization has now completely faded. In late 2025, the GDP growth slowed to 0.1%. For 2026, the IMF forecasts a very weak growth of the Russian economy, projecting around 0.6% of GDP. It is expected to stagnate with persistently elevated inflation. That underscores the steep slowdown from Russia's 4.3% GDP growth back in 2024, which had been fueled by heavy wartime spending. Such structural stagnation is projected to persist well beyond 2026 due to today's war-driven pressures. Until 2025, growth rested on a sharp rise in state spending, which increased by roughly a quarter in 2024, but this driver disappeared last year, and there is no obvious catalyst to revive growth in 2026. Last year, for the first time since the pandemic, Russia collected less budget revenue than originally planned. When this budget was approved, revenues were set at around $500 billion, but updated forecasts suggest that they will come in closer to $447 billion. This marks a break from the previous 3 years, including 2024, when revenues consistently exceeded initial projections. This led the Kremlin to order higher tax collection to sustain war spending, Tax increases and revenue declines indicate that the war is largely financed by shrinking domestic economic activity rather than robust trade surpluses. Oil and gas. We spoke about this last time, a month ago. These two factors have historically funded between 30 and 40 and 50% of Russia's federal budget and a large share of war financing. But these revenues have fallen at least by a quarter last year. 2026 is likely to bring another year of weak budget incomes for Russia. The World Bank expects a global oil supply surplus to push Brent crude oil prices down from the average of $68 a barrel to around $60 a barrel this year, the lowest level in 5 years. The price of Russian Urals crude have also been trading below historical levels. Independent trackers reported prices even lower in early January this year, with Urals near $35 a barrel, the lowest in many years. Additional pressure on the Russian budget and energy sector is put by new sanctions imposed by the United States last October against its two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Moscow was forced to agree to ever larger discounts on oil, sometimes to more than $30 per barrel. Following the introduction of new US sanctions, Russia's oil and gas revenues in December 25 fell by almost 50% compared to a previous year. While the so-called shadow fleet has helped Russia accumulate up to $100 billion in annual revenue, it has not stopped export revenue declines overall. Increased seizing and sanctioning of such vessels and recent legal actions against them signal even greater constraints ahead. The United States and partners have sanctioned Russian tankers as part of measures targeting the primary source of war funding. As a result, shipments in the week to January 4th fell to 3 million barrels a day, the lowest since August. On the monetary side, the Russian central bank was forced to raise interest rates to a record high of over 20% to curb rapid inflation. This reduced corporate profits as businesses stopped investing. Production in some industries fell sharply and corporate debt rose rapidly. Economists point to the potential of a banking crisis by November 26, caused by the expansion of corporate lending in the first 3 years of the war. Russian bankers themselves sounded the alarm about the growth of problem loans, with some even stating that many companies are in a pre-default state. Russia's reserves and hence its ability to absorb economic shocks look large on paper but are strategically constrained and fragile. As of late 2025, the central bank reports $720 billion in international reserves, yet a large part of them remains frozen in Western jurisdictions. Of the accessible portion, 40% accounts for gold, an asset illiquid under sanctions and difficult to monetize at scale. Russia's National Wealth Fund, the true fiscal buffer for deficits, has been heavily depleted from $145 billion pre-war to now $35 billion by mid-25. Ongoing budget deficits of roughly 3 to 4% of GDP, driven by military spending and weaker energy revenues, mean the fund is being drawn down to plug gaps rather than invest, with credible projections that it could be exhausted in 2026 if conditions persist. Out quick loans that they cannot repay. But this war has also created a true demographic shock for Russia. Just imagine this figure. Since Putin began his war in February 2022, there have been over 1.2 million Russian casualties, killed or wounded. Last year, Russia was losing on average 1,200 soldiers a day, or 50 soldiers an hour, or almost 1 soldier per minute. So during this emergency meeting of the Security Council, most probably around 100 Russian soldiers will have lost their lives. These losses have consequences for Russian economy as well. About 70% of its casualties are men aged from 20 to 39, the core male labor and fertility cohort. Simultaneously, around 900 most young educated Russians have immigrated since 22, removing precisely the workers with the highest productivity and tax contribution. As a result, Russia entered 2026 with an estimated labor shortage of 6.5 million workers projected to widen to 11 million by 2030. This shrinks the tax base while raising pension, healthcare, and compensation costs, structurally degrading Russia's capacity to finance both a modern economy and a prolonged high-intensity war. These developments create a systematic economic effect which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to cover ongoing war costs without deepening economic pain at home. Sustaining such a protracted, resource-intensive conflict requires consistent, robust revenue streams, and current trends show that these streams are on the verge of collapse in 2026. So it is precisely this catastrophic state of Russia's economy that is driving Moscow to issue ultimatums and use Oreshniks and other ghosts to coerce the international community into accepting its terms for ending the war. It is Russia that finds itself in a Zugzwang. Mr. President, let me reiterate, Ukraine will continue to seek peace, a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, based on international law and grounded in the principles of the Charter. Ukraine remains fully committed to the peace process initiated by US President Donald Trump. We commend the mediation efforts of the United States and active diplomatic efforts of our European and other partners that seek to pave the way for genuine peace. Last weeks were marked by an intensive shuttle diplomacy in Florida, in Paris, with personal engagement of President Volodymyr Zelensky. What we see, though, is that Russia deliberately derailing these peaceful initiatives. To conclude, I would first of all appeal to our allies and partners who have been strongly helping Ukraine. All the available air defense systems and missiles in stockpiles must be transferred immediately to protect civilians and energy infrastructure from Russian bombs. We also need long-range weapons to neutralize future attacks. We call upon our allies to introduce additional sanctions and increase economic pressure on Russia, including tougher measures targeting the shadow fleet, further restrict energy revenues as well as Moscow's ability to acquire critical components for weapons production. We also wish to appeal to all those UN member states who have so far remained neutral and continue to claim that sanctions are unacceptable or useless. This is a wrong approach. They are highly effective despite their imperfect implementation. The medicine is working. It is the dose that should be increased. As long as Russia keeps abusing its veto power, blocking the Security Council, coordinated sanctions are the only way to push Moscow towards peace. Mr. President, Russia resembles the Soviet Union in its final years of decline, before it imploded. It is not an expanding superpower, but a rigid, overextended system burdened by unbearable military expenditures and internal decay. No one expected the USSR to crumble overnight, yet it happened. The historic parallels with present-day Russia are strikingly similar. Today's Russia is like a colossus with feet of clay, and it is only a matter of time before this entire house of cards collapses. So our message to Russia is very simple, and I will put it in Russian language, since you have claimed that this language is being prohibited or discriminated in Ukraine. Все, ребятушки, приплыли.
That's it, guys. We're here. Let's dry our oars.
Very soon, I think.